Good evening and welcome to Pellowe Talk. We have an excellent show coming up for you tonight. We have Professor Emeritus David Flint, a Professor of Constitutional Law, and we also have the Katter Party MP, leader of the party in Queensland, Robbie Katter, who will be joining us to talk all about the policies that the Katter Party is offering voters in electorates where they're standing candidates for the upcoming Queensland electorate. We've got lots of issues to talk about with Robbie Katter, and also joining us, the fantastic political commentator James Macpherson, whose show comes out first thing this morning on Tuesday mornings, and you need to make sure you have a listen to that. There's so much madness going on in the world that he will help you laugh, and if you don't laugh, you'll have to cry. Well, it's never been this urgent to maximise your vote and voice in political elections. The Queensland state government election is at the end of the next month, and the differences between the two major parties have never been clearer. There are also increasingly bright alternatives in the minor parties right of centre for voters who are less motivated by pork barrelling handouts and more motivated by the clear and appalling violations of human rights by those left of centre. Under the cavalier leadership of Jackie Trad, the Labor Greens coalition has, in this current term of Parliament, introduced pro-abortion legislation which is impossible to hyperbolise. Sold to the unsupportive electorate as merely decriminalising women who feel they have no other choice, amendments to guard against very late-term abortions, sex-selective abortions, and domestic violence coerced abortions were rejected by the Labor Greens government. This Labor Party also criminalised doctors whose consciences forbade them assisting patients to kill their preborn children with a referral to someone less committed to doing no harm to living humans, and made it illegal to pray quietly within 150 metres of an abortion clinic. The Labor Greens clearly believe freedom and taxpayer funding to kill your female children hours before they're due to be born is what makes a society healthy and successful. But public displays of spiritual humility seeking help from heaven, or human offers to help those frightened women who feel they have no other choice, are an intolerable impediment into the profits of the abortion industry. Of course, no abortionist is going to offer to support the mother's journey of pregnancy and motherhood in the counselling they offer. The radically pro-abortion Labor Greens coalition see no need for removing the conflict of interest present when an abortionist provides abortion counselling. Informed consent is impossible to guarantee when her counsellor only gets paid if they perform an abortion. That's about as helpful as getting business coaching from a business insolvency agent who only gets paid if your business dies. If politicians wanted to offer a real choice, they would empower women with multiple options, not just one. There would be funding for the numerous community services which rely entirely on volunteers and donations to offer ongoing counselling without financial conflicts of interest, information without pressure, and an ongoing support before and after delivery of their baby. To be pro-abortion in any measure or for any reason is inexplicable unless one is either anti-science or anti-human rights. It is beyond comprehension any politician can sleep at night having participated in the taxpayer-funded deliberate killing of more than 80,000 Australians every year. If there is any love of justice left in our society, we must urgently make pro-abortion politicians as rare as pro-slavery politicians. What policy could possibly be more important to a society worth preserving than ending the cruel, bloodthirsty trade in child sacrifice? I implore viewers and listeners, for the love of all that is right and good, to make this the deal-breaker issue in choosing your preferred representative in state and federal governments until providing or promoting elective abortions are a death blow to any medical or political careers or ambitions. How do we do that? How do we influence the moral compass of a government so ethically corrupt it actually celebrates its bloodlust? It's actually quite easy if we just use the tools of democracy and the liberty which still remains while we can. But that is not the only policy of abusing human rights promoted in the Labor Greens coalitions around this nation. Euthanasia, too, is a policy intended for this year, but too risky with voters before an impending election. The Labor government instead is cynically relying on the common short-term memory of voters and will certainly legislate the right for doctors to kill their patients next year if they wait that long. As with abortion, they go through the pretense of asking the Law Reform Commission to make recommendations. They have not really abdicated government to a committee, though. They know full well that the recommendations will be just as extreme as they want them to be, but with the added bonus of being able to congratulate themselves for dissolving democracy and following the technocrats' advice, the recommendations of unelected and unaccountable, largely anonymous stuffed shirts. Euthanasia laws, given all sorts of touchy-feely euphemisms to tart up the ugly truth, are a nuclear bomb solution to an abandoned building. Let's be honest with each other, which will be terribly inconvenient to the nefarious agenda in such an important debate. No one wants to end their life. What is commonly wanted is an end to unbearable suffering. If we can be that honest with each other, we can start with agreement and work towards a sensible solution. But being yet more honest, it's critical to understand there are a mere handful of jurisdictions in the world which have experimented with calling death therapy. Ending life is not a therapeutic option, unless we are now dishonestly undefining the word therapy. I won't go into the very complex and technical debate around this topic because there simply is no need. No jurisdiction which has liberalised euthanasia has not had unintended casualties. It would be the height of willful ignorance to insist passing these laws in Queensland and other states will have sufficient protections where all others having the same intentions and resolve as we might have yet still failed to protect their citizens. If we've agreed the goal is to end suffering instead of lives, there is a much safer, less reckless solution to the roughly 3% of deaths, that is all, which end badly. No one is suggesting cruel prolonging of suffering or mandating radical interventions in natural death. If someone refuses treatment, that is not euthanasia. Palliative care and pain management is incredibly advanced, and where people die badly these days, it is almost entirely attributable to inadequate funding or inadequate training in palliative care. Both of these governments can fix without making doctors killers or radically cauterizing the ethical sensitivities our society should have. I hope and pray that no follower of my commentary ever takes a how to vote card, HTV, at an election booth ever again, unless it's to help unthinking voters to vote for the candidate you've independently decided is best for your state or nation. Letting someone else decide how you should fill out your ballot is at best lazy, and at worst, social vandalism, risking the kind of human rights abuses advocated by our worst candidates, as I've just detailed. Here's how you can make your vote count like it never has before. Now, pay close attention because you will not find this kind of advice anywhere. It serves no agenda, so mainstream media and political parties will not repeat it. The first step is to make a decision that you have no loyalty to any party or politician, no loyalty to anyone but God. If you don't believe in God, make your loyalty to the best interests of your neighbours and nation, especially the most vulnerable. This is critically important to rehabilitating our dissolving democracy as it inverts the power relationship from being narrowly vested in those political and media elites who demand the right to set the agendas and returns it to the people. Minister means servant. A government minister is the leader in serving the nation. Politicians are there to work for us. They get the privilege of office as long as they are competent and courageous in their convictions. We do not work for them, even if we are members of their political parties. They have to earn the right to represent us by swearing to fight for what is most important to the majority of first party members and then voters at an election. The voter's role in this transaction is to communicate to the candidates what it takes to earn your support. As an undecided voter, you can honestly approach every candidate in your electorate and interview them for the job. I say specifically in your electorate because you will not find the party leaders' names on your ballot forms. We do not vote for premiers or PMs, as much as they like to parade their personalities around in their campaigns as some kind of qualification. You have to choose which of the candidates in your local electorate is best qualified and competent to do the job they're being hired for. If they've been in the job, you may rely on their personal voting record to help answer these questions. If they deceived you about their values previously, fire them. Find a better qualified person for the job. Now understand this, your vote is not an endorsement. You're not saying you agree with your number one preference on everything. Your job is to indicate which of these names on the ballot is most likely to do a better job than all the other options on that piece of paper. If it helps you to understand how simple this is, number it backwards. Who would be the worst? Put them last. Who would be the next worst? Put them second last. You can complete your whole ballot this way. And that's why it's called preferences. You prefer your number one to your number two, your number two to your number three, and so on. It doesn't mean you actually like any of them. Failure to number all your preferences is to let other people decide them for you. Always number every box. I'll speak more about this in the near future and have already previously in other videos available on my YouTube channel. I found myself supporting a candidate recently from a party I wouldn't normally find much affection for, but my preferred party's candidate wouldn't respond to my questions, and the candidate who earned my support assured me he'd fight against pro-abortion legislation if he was elected. Being the only one who did, he earned my first vote. Such a person, if the only one running, should always be your number one vote until there's no such thing as pro-abortion candidates. I know candidates who are anti-abortion, but not very confident about saying so. They have commented to me that they've received such great courage to fight for justice like this by the number of people who ask about their stand on abortion. It's an important issue, but many like to believe it's not an election issue. But nor was slavery, until the world's first grassroots human rights movement made it one. This is why your political education and involvement is critical. The real political power always comes from the grassroots, unless they are kept uninformed and under control. So rise up. My final encouragement to you is to throw all your support behind the candidate from any party who you have thoughtfully determined to be better than all the others. Donate to them, volunteer for them, and encourage your friends to support them in all the ways you are too. This Queensland election at the end of next month is more critical than any other before. They all seem to be these days, but now is the time to choose to be an undecided voter. Do your research, choose your own preferences, and help the best candidate in your local electorate to win. Now, joining me this evening, as I mentioned, is Professor David Flint. Welcome to Pellowe Talk Live, not Q&A, Professor Flint. Wonderful to have you with us.
Thank you very much. And I did agree with you. I thought you presented that very well. I think the analogy, the relationship between slavery and abortion is very significant. You made a very good point there. The British people wouldn't have normally been thought of as voting for slavery. They certainly voted for a House of Commons which supported it.
Thank you. Yeah. Now, your volume is actually very, very low, so I'm not sure if we need to get you to lean a little closer and speak a little bit louder, but I'm sure there's a bunch of people who are are going to be finding it difficult to hear you. And you've got such important things to say. Now, you are a strong advocate for the restoration of democracy as designed in our Constitution, and a critic of the departures thereof. I'm very pleased to be able to assist you in some small way to communicate the things that you can offer as advice and counsel for how we can take back this democracy and this constitution, which we've come so far from with various methods. And your show is going to be produced on the Good Source and added to circulation regularly on a Thursday morning. Why don't you tell us a little bit about your show in particular, what you have in mind for it, and the campaign, the mission in general that people who are sympathetic to may find some benefit from tuning into regularly?
Certainly, David. For a number of years now, when I've been speaking to people, I've put a question to them, and I've asked people something which concerns me and I think concerns many Australians. Can they identify a significant problem in Australia if it weren't created by the politicians, has been made significantly worse by them? And people go away and they think, and I cannot find anybody who can point to a significant problem which wasn't created by the politicians or made worse by them. I think we've reached a stage where the political class in Australia is probably the worst in our history, and certainly not at the standard of that which prevailed in this country decades and decades ago. And I think in terms of the great achievement of federation, which was an extraordinary achievement, but it still didn't work with the politicians. What happened, David, was that once it was generally agreed that it would be a good idea, it would be good for the future of this country, the 6 colonies united. And that was done with the great support of the British. The British didn't oppose it. They strongly supported it. And when they first proposed it, they were rebuffed. But they certainly encouraged it. But once we came to a general realization that federation should occur, in the first proceedings, the first convention, what happened was that the convention would be appointed by the politicians. They drafted a very good constitution, drafted essentially by Sir Samuel Griffiths, former Premier and Chief Justice of Queensland. But they couldn't get it through because when it went back to the colonial parliaments, they all fell apart and disagreed and tried to have all sorts of bargaining. And it was clear that if it were left for the politicians, we'd probably be now 5 or 6 countries. We wouldn't be a single country on a single continent. It just would not have happened. And there was a remarkable popular conference, a conference of people, not elected by the public, not appointed by the politicians. That took place at Corowa on the New South Wales-Victorian border. And there was a quite remarkable man there, Sir John Quick, who of course is absolutely forgotten now, certainly not known by school children and not taught about to school children, but in many ways, even more than Parkes and the others, was very much the father of federation because he proposed at the conference, why not take it from the politicians and give it to the people? What he proposed was that there should be a convention not appointed by the politicians, but elected by the people, first point. The second point was even more important, that when it came to its final draft, having consulted widely and put it out for further final consultation, the convention itself would then settle the final version, and that would be submitted to the people by way of referendums in each state, in each colony as they then were. That is what happened. It took 2 rounds because the New South Welsh were rather more difficult than anybody else. And eventually it was passed. The extraordinary thing the really extraordinary thing was that with 2 rounds of referendums, with taking it to London, to the British Parliament, without computers and aeroplanes and modern forms of communication, certainly no internet, it was put through the British, it was approved here, put through the British Parliament. Within 4 years, we had a country. Extraordinary thing. You can't, as you know, you can't build a dam in 4 years here. And we had the experience in Sydney, where they put down a tram track in George Street. 19th century technology, basically. And it took about 6 years. We can't do things like that. Our ancestors built the country, and it was a superb constitution. It had some weaknesses, as any constitution does. But that then, gradually over the years, was over-centralized. Some of the people who went to the conventions wanting a highly centralized Australia got onto the High Court and then made the Constitution more centralized than the people ever intended. We've got a situation where the country is an enormous mess. You pointed, for example, to politicians getting into Parliament with abortion agendas. We had that in New South Wales after the last election. And of all parties, it was the Old Country Party, the National Party, which proposed abortion law reform. Nobody seemed to be asking for it in New South Wales. But it also included what was happening in America, that is an element of infanticide. That is, if a child escaped the abortion, they would then work out how to kill that child in the nicest possible way. This was led very much by certainly people of the left, but also the National Party. Extraordinary thing. How they got into Parliament, I have no idea.
Yes.
We really need to do something about the politicians. The political parties, as you know, David, are captured. The major political parties have neutered their membership, and effectively run by power brokers, and the pre-selections resulting not the person being chosen on merit, they're chosen because of their loyalty to a particular power broker.
I actually like one of your ideas to democratize the parties, and you put it this way, that if they are to receive public funding, and they receive a lot of public funding, then there should be complete public transparency, and we should know a whole lot about how those parties are run, and that furthermore their leaders should be democratically elected, not from the parliamentary party, but from the membership as a whole. Have I summed that up rightly? Would there be any other details you'd like to detail?
You've done it very well. And it's not only money that the parties get, they get all sorts of legal privileges, exemptions from the Electoral Act, from the Privacy Act. They get the names of the parties on the ballot papers. The advantages are enormous. It's a whole cornucopia of legal and financial advantages. You're absolutely right.
Yeah, they get exemptions from the Do Not Call register, and as you said, some privacy things. Now, people are still finding it quite hard to hear you. I'm sorry, so we will have to ask you to speak up consistently. But let's bring in our other panelists right now. We welcome to the show to Robbie Catter. Where are you joining us from tonight, Robbie?
Yeah, David, thanks for having us on. I'm in Cairns on the campaign trail, so from my hotel room in Cairns.
Awesome. And we also have James Macpherson. Welcome, James and Robbie.
Thanks, Dave. Great to be with you, and great to be with the other gentlemen as well.
Now, Professor David Flint was just detailing for us some ideas about getting back to the Constitution that he's got. His new show on The Good Source is going to be published every Thursday morning for the foreseeable future. And it's a great show, great conversations from a great legal mind and historian of Australian democracy. But one of the ideas, and let's just talk to this particular detail, is that political parties, and wouldn't this be novel, even if just the major parties, but why not all, if the members of those parties were the ones who got to choose the leader of the party, the registered members of that party, their popular vote ended up having the final say in who would be the premier or prime minister or opposition leader. You first, Robbie. What are your thoughts on that?
I can't give you a well-formed view on the internal machinations of a large party like that. That sounds good to me. In principle, I like anything in politics that puts us on an even playing field. So I would yearn for the day that the major party, whoever's in government, has to fight and convince people of the virtues of the things they're selling in the parliament, as I have to do. So we get private members' bills through. Our party's got 3 private members' bills through parliament. I think there's only about 14 in Queensland's history have gone through. But you can do that if you can convince people of the virtues of what you're selling. So we're more than willing to go up against anyone based on the virtues of what, it's good for the state, it's good for, it's good policy. That's competition breeds good, good performers, and they seem, and I guess that same applies in the larger party. So I haven't had enough experience to see how this stuff plays out. Certainly I see how dysfunctional Parliament is now from the 2-party system, because there's not enough competition in there, and that's not an endorsement for my party. That's just saying, debates aren't debates in Queensland State Parliament doesn't even have a Senate, so we don't have debates. You have 13, written scripts for all the backbenchers to go on a predetermined outcome of that vote. So no one's going in there with the debate trying to convince others to change their vote. No one ever changed their vote. That's all decided by their bosses beforehand. So to fix Parliament, you've got to create that competition in there where, the government of the day has to even convince their own members that this is good stuff and that they've got that freedom. But I couldn't give you a well-informed comment on the democracy within the parties. I haven't had enough experience inside a major party to sort of give you a well-informed view on that. That's
okay. You've said quite a few things I want to pick up on there, but before we move along, I want to give James a chance to comment. James, since the Kevin 07 personality Olympics election that we had to have, we've seen a revolving door of prime ministers in our nation. Do you think that would have been the case, or do you think we would have had less sovereign risk and more government stability if the leaders of the party weren't chosen by career protective party room ministers and members, but they were actually chosen by an annual conference of party members?
No, I don't think that would be the way to go, any more than I think the Australian public should choose the Australian cricket captain. If you're leading a team, then it doesn't make sense to have people unaware of the personalities, the machinations, the particular gifting and skill set of people to be making those kind of decisions. So you're right, it was a clown show back in the Rudd years, but I think that affected the reputation of the Labor Party more than it did the country, to be honest. And I would not subscribe to a system where the party members choose the leader and then everybody else is bound to have that person as their captain. I think the team has to appoint the captain, not the spectators.
Your thoughts on that, David, before we move on?
Well, the proposition is that the parties, in return for all of their advantages, be open, transparent and democratic. And that's been taken as far in the UK and Canada of the leaders being chosen with a limited franchise. Not a limited franchise, but a limited selection. Both the Labour and Conservative parties in the UK do this. The leading Canadian parties do, and quite a few other countries allow the membership at large to choose. And we've of course seen the most dramatic example of that, and that was in the United States in 2016 when President Trump was chosen from completely outside through a series of primaries, which the Americans like. It seems to work in a number of countries, but I do think that aside, the party itself should be open, transparent, and democratic, and at least pre-selections should be determined by the members in that electorate, whether it's the state at large or the Senate or in relation to electorates. And that doesn't happen in a large part of the Commonwealth.
Now, I've got some comments here. I might actually ask you to, Robbie, I do want to get you to talk a lot tonight, and really, I mean, we'll pass judgment on you brutally, but I really want to get an insight into the policies of the Katter Australia Party candidates. You'll be looking to increase your numbers in Parliament from 3, I'm quite sure. So let me see. There was a comment here. Here we go. Anita Maguire is trying to articulate that my encouragement to actually engage with every candidate in your electorate, to choose between them, survey them, get to know them and understand them. She's basically saying you can't really judge them by what they say to you by phone or email. What are your thoughts about the reliability of I guess you could also ask this 2 ways. How reliable is getting to know your local candidates, all of them in an upcoming election, as much as you can, getting their answers to some pretty pointed questions, and what can you do if they're going to mislead you?
Yeah. I'm not sure I'm going to directly answer that question. I'll do my best.
Sure.
The best way I think to answer that question is, to me, and I just reflect on my own ambition in politics, is to demonstrate to people that you may not agree with me, but it's important for me to demonstrate to you that some of the stuff I'm going to do is not self-serving. The position we took on taxis versus Uber, there's 30 taxi licenses, I think it is, in my entire electorate. So clearly I'm not doing this to promote myself, and I spent a lot of political capital on that because there was a principle at play. And I don't really care if you even agree with me in principle, but if I can demonstrate enough times to people that you're principle based, I think that's going a long way to that gains you a lot of trust, I think. And look, I'm not that clinical or that good at planning or making my position, finding my position, but the evidence here, like, I'm not trying to brag saying this, but I got the highest vote in the last state election in Queensland, and I didn't even know that until I got back down to Palm. Someone told me that, but I guess, and the funny thing is, I deliberately in the last Parliament, I was just going after big fish, and some of it, I really thought I was running the risk that I'd lose the electorate because I was going after some bigger issues that I really wanted to effect change on. And I often still try and reflect on what was led to that position, to getting that vote. And I could only say that I think people will trust you if they see that some of the things you're going after aren't self-serving. And a lot of politicians go on and they want to deliver a new swimming pool and a new basketball court to the school and a new extension of the hospital. That's all good stuff. There's nothing wrong with it. But I think they'd like to see that you're doing some things that they can see as a bit, a bit more about the long-term planning and less sort of self-serving as a politician. So I think that's somewhere in the mix of trying to earn people's trust and trying to. You're not going to. I was saying to one of our candidates tonight, don't say to people, "Trust me, I'll do it," or words are cheap in politics now. So.
Yeah, so true. Yep. Now, due to the fact that you were on another call just prior to joining us, and thank you very much for squeezing us into your very busy schedule tonight, you wouldn't have heard my opening comments about choosing a candidate from all of those that are available with an open mind, examining what they all stand on, and then choosing those who will fight for justice and human rights the most. And I want to come back to that in just a moment and start getting into some of those human rights and justice policies and examining Katter's position on those. But I first met Professor David Flint at a Boot Brisbane forum, which is all about creating a new state by dividing Queensland in half at some particular location to be determined. So he and I have that in common. And James Macpherson is recently stopped pastoring a significant church in Queensland, which actually included 8 different locations, not least of which in Townsville. It was the main location where you lived in Townsville, James?
Yeah, that's right.
So, Robbie, I know you've spoken about creating a new state, and even put a motion up in Parliament to see where that can go. Why don't you outline that for us and what you think the pros and cons are of that?
So I think you'll find it's about in the last 150 years since we've created our last state. The United States created 23 new states. They've developed, prospered, utilised their resources more to build more cities, and you build in a different area and a large cultural divide develops. So it seems pointless having those people govern you from over there because there's a large cultural shift in values and these people are developing where you're more established and developed down there. So that builds that cultural divide. That's how countries developed everywhere. And I sort of turn the question around and say, if you think our founding fathers drew these lines on a map 150 years ago and said they should be the line for forever and should never be challenged ever, I think that is absolutely nuts. Not doing justice to our founding fathers. They thought we'd be smart enough to every now and again, perhaps every 50 years, say, is this working out well for us? Is this the best way to govern ourselves, our resources, our cultural differences? And, I guess the only argument against all that is, do we need more politicians? Well, that's what they said about Queensland when they cut off from New South Wales. And then they said, you don't have the money or the resources or the people. Well, that's what they said 150 years ago. And if, another good analogy is the North Queensland Cowboys. When they started off, they didn't even have enough money to make the salary, the salary cap. They didn't even have that much money. They didn't have the player base. They said they'll never survive. And they became a great team that won a grand final and played against Brisbane and laid the foundation for a great state of origin side.
Yeah.
It developed, and it's a good analogy, I think, for what can happen in the state. And it's not just about Queensland. I mean, if I lived in Melbourne, I should share exactly the same view. It's not being parochial. It's saying we want the country to develop. And do I think Brisbane's doing a good job of managing the resources or the cultural difference up here? No, they're doing a terrible job. And that's not because they hate North Queensland. They just don't understand it because they're 2,000 kilometres away trying to govern from there. I couldn't do it. I'd do a terrible job too from Brisbane. So that's what it's about. And I think it makes a hell of a lot of sense. And I think the country would yield more dividend from dams being built. I think the environmental outcomes would be better. I think the whole system would work a lot better if I had more control over things up in the north. And I think I'd do my job exactly what I'm doing now, but I could do it better because I'd have more autonomy.
Yep. James, Robbie mentioned the word parochialism, and I'm well aware of the competition between, I guess, the southern states. We have to keep those Mexicans out of Queensland. The border closures aren't all bad. We're losing some Victorians. But I was shocked. At the antipathy towards southeast Queenslanders when I finally left the comfort of the cooler climes down here to go up to the more humid places up north. Now, you've spent a lot of time there and known and walked closely with a lot of people. What's the sentiment like? Is there a great deal of frustration towards this remote and distant government, its interference in the lives up there? And what's your personal thoughts? Do you think a separate state might go some way to solving some of those challenges?
Yeah, you mentioned, is there antipathy to the interference of the state government in North Queensland. I think it's the opposite. There's a lot of upset about the lack of involvement from the state government in North Queensland. The sense in North Queensland is that much of the state's revenue is generated in the north and it's spent in the south. Politicians, in my experience in North Queensland, tended to fly in around election time and then you never saw them again, except maybe if the Cowboys were doing really, really well. So I think, look, what I couldn't believe when I moved to Townsville was that if you're in Brisbane, it's as far to travel north to Townsville as it is south to Melbourne. So just ask yourself if Melburnians would like to be governed from Brisbane, and you might understand why Townsvillians, for instance, think Robbie's idea of a North Queensland state might not be such a bad idea. No one wants to be governed by people thousands of kilometres away. You end up out of sight, out of mind. And I think there was very much that sentiment, whether or not it was true, but there was that sentiment in North Queensland that was strongly expressed on a regular basis.
Professor David Flint, we want to move on to other topics quite quickly, but I do want to get a word from you on this. Is there provision in the Constitution? Is there one way? Is there 5 ways? How would this work? How would it be achieved if there was a will to create a new state in Queensland?
One of the problems of federation was to get everybody in, and particularly to get the Queensland government in, which was being threatened then, with new states in the centre and in the north. And it really now, under the Constitution, really depends on the parliament of the old state, whether the state can be broken up. So you've got to really get the Queensland Parliament to agree to have a referendum in the north for a separate state. There's a very good argument for it, and I live in a state, I'm living in Sydney at the moment. 2/3 of the population of New South Wales is in Sydney. So that means the concentration of legislative power is in Sydney, and the whole state is governed for the benefit of this little part of the state which is called Sydney. And it doesn't matter what happens in the country. Sydney couldn't care less what happens in the country. We desperately need, even in New South Wales, for new states, and I can see it so clearly in Queensland, where I think you have about over 3/5 of the people of Queensland are in the southeast corner. All the wealth up there in northern Queensland is being produced, but it's not being developed, it's not working for the benefit of the people there. So you can't have policies up there in northern Queensland which will attract more investment. I mean, they could have their own taxation policies. That of course, would involve a decentralisation in Canberra, as the Constitution intends, but also a decentralisation within the states. And the argument for a new state is so overpowering in North Queensland and Central Queensland. And Robbie's right. You look at America, you look at Switzerland, you look at Austria, Germany. There are plenty of states in the world smaller and not as rich, not as economically wonderful as North Queensland, and there's no reason, and it would be run so much better if it were run from North Queensland rather than from down in Brisbane.
Now, I was a latecomer to the Trump train. While ever there remained anybody else in the American primaries in 2016, I was for them. I think somebody who's been pro-life for 5 minutes is not my kind of representative. However, he's probably been one of the most pro-life presidents, if not the most pro-life president that America has had, certainly since Roe v. Wade. So credit to him. He might have been late to the party, but he's thrown his full weight behind it. However, somebody who's not late to the party, as Daniel McCarthy joins out, is Katter's Australia Party. Daniel says it needs to be acknowledged that Robbie Katter's KAP is the only party that has a rock-solid, non-negotiable anti-abortion policy for their MPs. That takes courage and conviction. The nation needs to thank Robbie and his team for his lead of this? Well, Robbie, I certainly thank you. And like I said before, I support those people who've been pro-life for a very long time with a whole lot more confidence than those who are recent to it, which isn't to take away their capacity to do good from this point forth. But what I'd like to do is open up, I guess, this next few minutes just for you to explain the CATA policy on choosing candidates, what part pro-life values have in that, and what your thoughts are for how, with multiple politicians in the next parliament, you might like to influence the abortion legislation, policies and possible amendments in Queensland.
Okay, that's a really big question.
Floor's yours.
Yeah, I'll do my best to answer that. If I don't interview every candidate we have personally, but that's a great question to sort of start off with, or perhaps you get through the niceties of a candidate interview, but that's one of the good ones to come in with to see test the mettle of someone, and it's that's just, I guess, something that we've embedded in our core values and principles, and I'm not too sure. It's sort of something that's just a natural part of who we are, so it's hard to comment much beyond that. And as for changing into the new parliament, we may have no ability to change much as a minor party. We're sort of relying on getting the numbers. If we can do that, that would be something that would be, how far do you go with that? Because I think the most recent change was they took it from 16 weeks to 20 weeks or something in Queensland. But when they brought it up in media, for all three MPs, we just said, whatever it is, we're opposing it. If it's coming out of Labor government in Queensland, we'll oppose it. So we'll try and take that back as far as we can. And that attracts me a pretty bit of criticism in some areas back home. But again, it's important to have a good, clear stance on those things. And that's about as much. I know it's not a great answer, David. That's about as good as I can give it. It's just it's a part of who we are, and it's a great way to identify people we're bringing into that they're culturally aligned with us in our party. And one thing that we value in our party, core value and principle number one, that's built in our constitution, is saying that you're obligated to vote in the interests of your electorate before the party, just so long as you agree with all the other core values and principles. Which is to say, you've got a lot of freedom in our party to vote how you want, but culture, that means when we're selecting candidates, we have to look very closely that culturally they align, because
good.
You need that alignment at the core.
Okay. Anna Hickson asks, are you planning to contest every seat in the upcoming Queensland election? And if not, where?
No, it's very difficult for us. Labor's done a very good job in this parliament of trying to constrain minor parties. So they, the fundraising laws, they changed legislation only a few months ago for fundraising laws, so that it'll cap, donation spends, how much fundraising you can do, and we have to. We run off the smile of Morley Reagan, and all credit to the major parties. They're a strong foundation. They've been there for a long time, but that also means they've banked up pretty big financial resources over the last 50 to 100 years, depending which one you talk about. So we're starting from scratch. Over the last 9 years, we've been trying to just get by from election to election. We don't have that bank behind us, and that means that you can't afford to run. If you want to run in every seat in Queensland, you need about $1 million or $2 million behind you, and there's not too. Unfortunately for our party, most of the causes that we're fighting are for battlers that don't have money. So we don't have a very good business model for winning elections. So we need to grow organically, stick to our strengths, and we get a lot of calls from people, in other electorates wanting us to run, but unfortunately, that doesn't mean we're going to get the 20 or 30% of the vote to win it. And you just got to grow and stick to your strengths and not try and be a flash in the pan or overnight success. So I think that can bring with it as many problems as it can benefits.
Yep. Lyle Shelton says, Robbie, your party's courage in supporting human rights for the unborn is greatly appreciated. Have you got any thoughts on exactly how your policy, I'm assuming you're going to be a champion of your own policy, but compare and analyse the Cat Australia abortion policy to the others that are on offer, if you'd be so kind?
Oh, well, I've got to be honest, and we don't have a detailed policy on it other than everything they've put through, we want to repeal. That's where we want to be.
So this is going to be the pointy question, would you recriminalise women who procure an abortion?
Well, what I'd say is we'd want to take it back to where it was before the politicians started getting their dirty hands all over it. So I think it should be. I think the thing to aim for is that there should be every. We wouldn't want it. We don't like it being decriminalised for a start because you're taking a life, and we don't think you have that right. And for us, the same applies to euthanasia. That's
great.
Those lives are not ours to take or give. That's not how we're consistent with those Christian values and beliefs that are core to our party. And we'd work back from there. But if you wanted to extend the conversation on it, like in that last suite of reforms Labor brought into Queensland, there's nothing in there in trying to support women or divert them into counselling or anything before just rocketing them into killing their unborn baby. And I've got to say this because it was a really poignant moment for me to understand the depths of these people's appetite for change, or if that's probably the kindest word you could call it. But I haven't seen cheering and jubilance at all in Parliament as I did the night that they voted for the right to kill babies. So they were celebrating. Now, I would argue, I don't know a lot of people have had abortion, but I'm sure none of them would be celebrating. It's a dark issue. It's not something you celebrate and cheer, and anyone that's probably touched by it would say it was a dark part of their life. It's not something you cheer and celebrate. So what the hell were they cheering and celebrating? And the Speaker of the House let them go, and they all jumped up in their chair. And if I did that, I'd be thrown out of Parliament. But and I still am trying to get my head around that. But to me, that says there's some dark forces at play out there that, and I'm not sure I've got a good grasp of what makes them tick.
I have to say, if we put things back to the way they were, I actually think we can go forward a whole lot better than we can go back. Because the way things were, it was as good as fully liberalised and decriminalised. There were 20,000 Queenslanders roughly being killed every year in abortion clinics with taxpayer funding. The way it wasn't working. Lyle Shelton adds his comment that women should never be criminalised, abortionists should be criminalised, and women should be supported. And in my opening remarks, I said support for or provision of abortion should end both political and medical careers. Those are two jobs where you're in charge of protecting people. You're in charge of promoting justice and people's health. Your thoughts on maybe criminalising elective abortions, voluntary abortions, where there's no life at stake other than the life being deliberately taken, and then providing real options. You've spoken about the real options and support for women. I can hear that in what you've already said. You're pro-supporting women. Do you want to add any clarification thoughts to that?
Yeah, look, you're probably above my pay grade here, Dave, in level of sophistication of dealing with this. I would make the excuse for myself in that you know, the volume of things we're hit with in Parliament, and we have 0 parliamentary staff. LNP have 22 staff, which means the government must have somewhere around 220 staff, because the opposition is entitled to 10% of their staff.
Wow.
To help them position themselves every Parliament. You go down roughly every 3 weeks to debate stuff, and we've got to go down there from our big electorates and research and position ourselves. So most of the time, we can't afford to have a whole host of solutions. And
yeah, I'm familiar with that. It's a real challenge. You're right.
It's more we go in there to block things, and we know it's wrong and we can block it. And sure, we've got some solutions on some things, but I couldn't give you a prescriptive way of how it should look, because it feels like most of the time we're just playing defensive and trying to stop what comes through. I would say, there was one guy from Labor there a couple of parliaments ago. I probably won't use his name. He said, he got kicked out of the party around this time before the election. He was the member for Palmerston then at the time, and he said, I think you had something to do with that not getting through in this Parliament, and if you did, thanks very much for your stand. And he sort of gave me an angry look and said, Rob, and I forget the number, but he said something like 5 babies have died on tables in Queensland in the last period. Yep. And walked away. And I thought, that's enough. And from that moment, I thought, you know what, I'm very grateful for whatever that bloke did, because I can see why he got kicked out of Labor at the time, because he was definitely, seems like he had some principles on that issue. And so, I'm critical of others, but there are some people in there that do take a hard line, that don't perhaps get the credit they should on these issues.
Yep. James, what are your thoughts on important policies for voters to consider? Anything in particular we might be able to ask Robbie about?
Just before I get to that, can I just say, Robbie, how impressed I am sitting here listening to you speak the way you have tonight. Firstly, it's so nice to hear a politician who puts forward the view you have, which I think is very courageous. I've got a good friend who is a senior ABC reporter in Queensland, and he was telling me that some years ago there was a parliamentary report into babies who were supposed to be aborted, but the abortion had not quite gone right, and the babies were born alive and left to die without medical care. He found this report and wanted to publish, and he said he had to fight tooth and nail to convince ABC editors to allow him to actually get that story into the public domain. And so I think people should be very grateful to you, because I can't imagine it's easy to be running for public office and to be articulating views, though I believe completely right, but so out of favour with powerful entities such as the ABC. So I think you need to be congratulated, regardless of how people vote. Thank you for being a leader who's willing to take a stand on this issue. More than that, can I just say I'm really impressed with the humility in the way that you've answered this question. It's quite refreshing to find a politician say, I don't have all the answers, or it's a bit above my pay grade, and yet this is what I believe, and this is why. And I just really appreciate your humility that you've displayed tonight. And people will start thinking I'm a Katter supporter, I'm being so complimentary of you, but one more compliment or an encouragement. I think there'll be a lot of people who perhaps hadn't considered the Katter Party, who, having heard your response on that question tonight, will certainly have another look and will be very impressed. I think you'll find you've got a lot more support than you possibly realised when you start to address issues such as abortion.
Exactly.
In the simple, no frills, humble way that you have. And I just want to honour you for that and say well done. I'm really impressed.
Oh, that's very generous. Thank you.
Did you want to add anything else to the conversation, James? Any other thoughts on abortion particularly, or perhaps steer it towards some other policies that North Queenslanders or Queenslanders in general might be interested in?
Well, if we talk about North Queensland, if you want to steer the conversation away from sort of moral issues towards more environmental or more particularly mining issues, we can go that way if you wish. I was interested, if we can just stay on topic for a moment. Robbie expressed not only the Katter Party's opposition to abortion, but also to euthanasia, which I think is a very good stance, and very pleasing to hear that as well, Robbie.
Well, that'll definitely be passed by the next Labor government should they be re-elected. They've clearly signalled their intention to do so by referring the legislation to the Law Reform Committee, and that's the way they passed this heinous abortion legislation, by pretending to get an outside committee to come back with doing exactly what they wanted to all along. Something I said at the beginning of the show, Robbie, was there's no jurisdiction in the world which has ever experimented with this legislation, euthanasia legislation, which has not had unintended casualties. It does kill citizens. There's no such thing as safe legislation with adequate protections, and it would be naive and arrogant to think we could be the first parliament in the world to do so. And what's more, the suffering which they seek to solve by killing patients is actually solvable by adequate funding and training in end-of-life care, palliative care. And so we're really just, it's a ridiculous and disproportionate and completely unnecessary solution to a problem that's easily solvable with funding and training. Robbie, talk to us about flying foxes.
Yeah, well, in Australia you can shoot your cull if you like. It doesn't have to be about shooting, but you can cull koalas, pigs, cats, deer, horses, but you can't cull flying foxes. And what they'll say to you, and quite rightly, is that, well, we can't track how many there are because they're migratory and they move a phenomenal distance, and they can move thousands of kilometres within weeks. So they're hard to track, and they say so. Therefore, they're hard to count the numbers. So we don't know if they're exploding in population or if they're diminishing. But they can overrun a town and completely destroy people's businesses, houses, way of life. And you're often powerless to move these on. And, it's a good example where there's virtues of people living thousands of kilometres away and not even necessarily in Brisbane, because some of it's federal legislation where they say, we don't like you touching those things, and it doesn't really harm us, but we're a bit sensitive on those issues, so you can't deal with it. And not everyone wants to shoot them or destroy them or wipe out the population. They would like the right to be able to handle it in the most cost-effective way, but they're never afforded that right, and they play all sorts of nasty tricks, like saying in Queensland they say, well, local councils can handle it, we'll give it to them. But the volumes of legislation, or the reams of legislation, makes it so difficult for usually underqualified council officers to try and wade through that most councils put their hands up in the air and go, well, we're not going to deal with it because it's too difficult unless we face a $50,000 fine. So they happily propagating and the Charters Towers, the town I was raised and grew up in, the beautiful parkway had all the school fetes, weddings, all those trees are decimated. You can't even cut down some of the trees because they're heritage listed. And, bats, they're saying the swimming pool's right next door. They bit 2 kids in the swimming carnival last year. So they talk about not having the swimming carnivals at night. Houses, people's properties ruined around the park, and we're still not allowed to move them on. What can be a better example of how ridiculous and encumbered we are by, virtue signaling from people thousands of kilometres away that are not impacted by this?
Actually, that's something I wanted to interject was I guess using the example, I grew up in a lot of different country towns, all south of southeast Queensland, New South Wales mostly. And in my recent journeys to North Queensland, much later in life, there's a lot of experiences I've had for the first time, despite being a country-raised kid, such as signs on the highways across dry creek beds where the road travels to watch out for crocodiles. Never seen that before, and it amused me greatly. And so we've got some people asking right now, what's the big deal with flying foxes? Is this really an important election issue? So maybe just detail for us how they impact on the life of North Queenslanders.
Well, I guess it may be a metaphor, perhaps, for the oppressive sort of government, or the oppression of those regulations, or those virtues being imposed on you that from different cultural sets. So you're saying I can't go outside with my baby, and I can't have my pets water outside in Charters Towers. There's a Lissy virus and all these things associated with the bats. They are vectors, but I can't do that because you're telling me you're not sure about the populations, but you just prefer that we didn't disrupt them and upset them when they're trying to perhaps breed or do whatever they're doing. I mean, I think this comes back to a values question again. Really, in my view, in a perfect world, the government of, whether it's from Canberra, Brisbane, anywhere, would say, you know what, Charters Towers, we trust that you don't hate nature, and we trust that you're just going to do the best thing. So you deal with them however you see fit. Just go and do it. And even if you need a bit of money, we might even help you with that, because it's a problem with government. We pay taxes so that we can help you with problems that are insurmountable or perhaps too big for you to handle. You go and do it, and we trust that most people are pretty good people, and they'll probably try and do the right thing. Now, if you apply that and took all the regulations away on the flying foxes, 90% of your outcomes are going to be just as good as they were before. No one's out there to obliterate the species, or we're all pretty sensitive on those things now. Just trust people are going to do the right thing, and I think we'd all be okay. But someone in Brisbane, I've literally had this in interviews where they say, if we just let you do what you want up there, wouldn't that be compromising environmental values? As if to say, we care more about the environment than you do up there. So It's probably we make the decisions for you. And I think it's a bit of a metaphor for that governance from afar, or that different cultural value, and it will impact. It will impact on how people vote, I think, because it's one of those barometers by which they can check: are you here to represent me, or are you here to represent those people with different values from 1,000 kilometres away?
Yep. Well, we're coming pretty close to the end of the show. I want to thank our guests for joining us tonight. We will take another 5 or 10 minutes and talk about another issue or two. But I want to encourage you, if you're enjoying this show, then help us fight fake news by becoming a Good Source supporter. Just head to the website goodsource.news and click on the tab that says support. You can also subscribe to email updates from all or some of your favorite contributors to the show, to the platform. There's lots of articles there, and really, really important. Put your money where your mouth is. If you can't stand the ABC and you're looking for some independent, honest news and opinions without the constant orange man bad, orange man very bad, very orange, then this is probably the right channel for you to be listening to. So that's goodsource.news, and we will endeavour to keep this coming and growing, adding more and more shows, and building the production there as well. So thank you very much for those people who are supporting it and making it happen. Robbie, I wonder if you can tell us exactly what you think would be a good plan for the economic recovery of Queensland following the lockdowns and the massive unemployment, which was probably never fantastic in the north part of the state. But what kind of projects would you be proposing would be good for both North Queensland and all of Queensland?
We're very good at mining and agriculture in this state, and at the moment, I would argue those industries are propping us up and will continue to prop us up in the next couple of years. They're not everything, but they play a big part. They're things I can talk with authority about. So we're trying hard to build a transmission line into Northwest Minerals Province, and that provides about $300 million a year in royalties alone. I think it's about $3 or $4 billion is the value of the economy there a year.
Wow.
But we've had the world's highest energy prices. That's the world's highest energy prices. Forget Congo or the basket case African countries. The world's highest energy prices are there in Northwest Queensland. So
Incredible.
you just neglect these areas of industry. And ironically, Mount Isa Mines was voted the most significant business in Queensland's 150-year history at the Q150 celebrations. So we recognise you've been a good performer, but we're not going to really help you. We're just going to neglect you until. But we're advocating for a transmission line that connects us with the national electricity grid, which brings energy prices down 30 to 50%. That almost sounds unrealistic. But that's what it will do. And if you bring energy prices down that in a mining area, as significant as that, you've got more. And I think they've labelled about 3,000 jobs created over the next 10 or 20 years. Actually, it wouldn't even be that much, but I think it may be the next 10 years. You've got, mines expand when you get cheap energy. So if you've got water, energy, and we've just got a mountain of resources in the area that I represent alone. It's a wonderful place to represent in that respect. But the biggest river systems we've got in Queensland are all up there. None of them, we don't store any of that water for the dry time. So you'd build some dams up there, you build a transmission line in the mining areas. We build a rail line in the Galilee Basin. That won't cost you anything. The government of the day is spending $12 billion to get people to work faster and across River Rail in Brisbane. To me, that's not a priority. Lovely, that'd be a great thing to give to people of Brisbane, but you do that when you can afford it. A coal mine pays the bills, and you can build 300 kilometres of rail line for $3 billion, not $12 billion, $3 billion into the Galilee Basin. It will pay for itself because the users will pay for it. You'll make money off that rail line. That's why private companies buy them, so you can make money off them. And that, at the very least, will deliver you $500 million, $500 million of just royalties alone a year. For what? For nothing. And on top of that, we'd mandate ethanol, so you give a second market to all the sugar and grain producers in the state. We can start producing fuel and within our nation. US, 63 other countries in the world mandate ethanol, so they've got fuel security, which is a national defence issue. And you're helping stimulate farming at the same time. Guess how much it costs you or me? Nothing. They changed us from leaded fuel to unleaded fuel 30 years ago, and I had no choice in that. You change to ethanol. All their cars are built for ethanol now anyway. They're more built for ethanol than not. And we don't mandate it here because we're too weak in government to say, hey, we need to do something that's going to stimulate farming and manufacturing in this state. So there's a couple of policies there that cost you nothing and will create hundreds of millions, if not billions, of dollars of revenue for the state. Not big vote winners because they're not visible and you don't cut a ribbon in the city on them, but they'll do a hell of a lot of good for Queensland and they'll help set us up for the future. So that's the sort of stuff we're focused on. And if we get any power, that's the sort of stuff we'll be driving to bring some prosperity back into Queensland and have some focus on that. And that's where we think the gap is.
Tell me more about the energy security proposals that you've got for cheap security. You're talking about a power line instead of a new power generator, a coal-fired power station or something similar up in North Queensland. Is that correct?
Yeah, so there's an interesting fact is that the baseload demand in Northwest, in Mount Isa where I live, because there's so many big mines out there, it's the same as introducing back into the national grid Townsville and Cairns, which are huge regional cities in Queensland by my standards, not by New South Wales standards, but they're big cities. So Mount Isa is as big as those two markets put together, and you're adding that into the grid. So currently it's not connected to the national electricity grid, so there's only one power supplier out there, Diamantina Power Station, which is gas. And because we had no gas reserve policy here in Queensland, gas prices shot up as I was predicted and as I was told they would. And we sold all the gas to overseas interests, and it pushed the price of gas up for all our locals, and we were the only ones that were really highly exposed because we only have gas-fired power in Mount Isa. That's why we've got the world's highest prices. But a transmission line that connects us to the grid will reduce that by 30 to 50%. So that's phenomenal, and that's good infrastructure, industry building infrastructure, cheap electricity, and I've got to say, probably with a fair bit of push from us and the KP, but the feds in the state, they have come to the party. They seem to be there's work at play there. So that's a great piece of infrastructure that we should have built 10 years ago, and we'd be reaping the benefit from it now.
I think we're just about at the end of the show. Let's just give viewers a minute or two to ask a question. If you've got a question, jump in. We're going to wrap the show up, but let's go around the panel and get some final thoughts from James and Professor Flint, and then if there's any questions for Robbie, we can finish with him. Professor Flint, what are your thoughts on the discussion we've had tonight?
Well, listening to Robbie, I can see how obviously he would be a significant force in the development of North Queensland, where there is obviously a great need for attention rather than down in southeast Queensland. We in New South Wales are desperate to buy water from Queensland. That old Bradfield plan, that sort of thing is such a wonderful thing that would be so wonderful for New South Wales right down through Victoria to South Australia, and it would perhaps be done in such a way that the flooding that you've had in North Queensland would be a thing of the past, and that water could be conserved and sold on to the other states and used for hydro. I think that there are wonderful schemes going up there. I was very interested in listening to Robbie about that. I was also very impressed by the way in which he was courageous in advancing a policy in relation to the right to life, which is very important. It seems to me that those politicians who support the right to life seem to be indicative of strongly principled politicians, one of which, of course, is the President of the United States. It may be a short-term conversion, but when he announced his policies in 2016 at Gettysburg, they were exactly the right policies which America and therefore the West needed. And he has been extraordinary in pushing as many as he can, notwithstanding the enormous opposition he's had. So all power to Robbie. I think he's got a policy, marvelous program there. And I think we should also be thinking of the American election because it is going to be so significant for us. America being the leader of the West, and we certainly don't wish, I would not think, to have America replaced by an alien power who doesn't advance the same principles and policies.
And James, your thoughts on the conversation this evening?
Look, as a former North Queenslander, I spent 10 years in North Queensland, 10 of the best years of my life. And North Queensland is a wonderful place, but has so much untapped potential. And I was very heartened to hear someone as articulate, as passionate, and as well thought through as Robbie Katter has been tonight. I know it sounded a little bit like the Robbie Katter fan club, but I think there was a lot that was very good for North Queensland tonight. And Robbie, I wish you all the very best in getting those thoughts and policies through, and may you do very well.
Okay, just trying to get myself on the big picture. There we go. All right, so Daniel has a comment. I'll take that as a comment. Our nation will grow enormously when we have more conviction politicians like Robbie Katter. I agree. I just want to see more politicians who lay it on the line. Tell me what you stand for. Let me hire you or fire you. But stop playing these games. And whatever you do, don't say what you think I want you to say. Say what you believe and what you're going to fight for the rest of your career. And as a question, just to throw into the energy security North Queensland conversation from Roscoe, dare I attempt at that? Schopenhauer. Nuclear power. Your thoughts on nuclear power, Robbie?
Ideologically, no issue at all, and probably has a place in our future. I think in the base load, the biggest issue with our energy prices in Queensland and it's not the same issue in New South Wales, is I don't know a short way to explain it, but it's the rip-off tax. You know, there's an accounting standard used by the government whereby they just rip a whole heap of revenue out of your power bill, and, you know, people fight and get a reduction on this tariff, but they just bump up the other tariff. So one way or another, they're just they're screwing money out of us and through the power bills in Queensland. And, you know, generation does always play a cost in trying to keep power prices down. But the one major impacting issue on power prices in Queensland is the government's greedy hand all over the bills, not so much the cost of generation. But certainly ideologically, all for nuclear power. And perhaps Mount Isa's got some big reserves out there that we'd love to play a role in that future. But it's not the burning issue in power right now, generation costs and getting that nuclear power. But certainly open to and supportive of that as playing a role in the future.
Yep. Well, thank you very much to the panelists for joining me tonight. It's always a great pleasure to have a great conversation, and it's one for the record books to listen back to. A few people saying they're going to watch this again to try and absorb all the information, which is fantastic. Let me repeat my encouragement from the beginning of the show. Declare yourself an undecided voter. Don't just vote the way your dad did or the way somebody tells you to, especially not the way the media tells you to. Don't be manipulated by your emotions. And don't be bought or conned by pork barreling. Think about your nation, think about your neighbours, think about some objective standards for the future, and then go and compare all of them genuinely. Write your own preferences, people. Think for yourselves. And once you've decided who the best candidate is, give them all of your support. If that's the best person for your nation and your neighbourhood, then you owe it to your nation and your neighbourhood to make sure they get elected. And that doesn't have to mean you agree with everything, but if they're the best of everybody that's put themselves forward, then that's who we need to get elected. So volunteer for them, donate to them, and help all your friends to do the same. And that way we're going to be able to make sure that pro-abortion candidates and politicians are as rare as pro-slavery candidates and politicians. And that would be a very good way to leave our nation for the next generation, those that actually survive pregnancy. But that's it for this episode of Pellowe Talk, #not Q&A. Thank you very much again to the panelists for joining us. And we look forward to seeing you next Tuesday night. And make sure you're tuned in tomorrow morning for the latest episode of The Lyle Shelton Show. And head to lyleshelton.com.au and put some support in. He is being taken to the next round of lawfare against conservative and family values in this nation, the weaponisation of the Queensland Human Rights Commission and anti-discrimination laws, and it will cost tens of thousands of dollars to defend himself while the taxpayer pays for drag queens to haul him through that punishing process. Head to lyleshelton.com.au and donate what you can there to that very important campaign, because it's not about Lyle, it's about freedom and justice for all of us. And maybe one other policy to add to this election campaign would be the abolition of the discrimination industry, which profits off prosecuting conservatives. And that's about it. You don't see them fighting for the right to travel in and out of our states or nation. We don't see them fighting for the right to life. We only see this prosecution of feelings in this industry, and it's a disgusting distortion of justice. But that's it for the show. So thank you very much, everybody, and good night.
If not now, then when will we see an end to all this pain? Oh, it's not enough to do nothing. It's time for us to do something.